All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Jordan Money. I'm the Director of Events and Communications for the Center for Security Studies and the Security Studies program. And before I turn it over to our speaker today, I have just a few quick notes for you. First, you have all been automatically muted. You all have been on Zoom for probably about a year now, so you know the etiquette, but just a reminder to please stay on mute unless you're asking a question so that we don't have any background noise. You are welcome to have your camera on or off for this event, and we do encourage you to turn your camera on during the Q&A portion so that we can engage a little bit more in discussion with Professor Zenn. On that note, we will have plenty of opportunity for questions. You are welcome, in fact, to ask questions throughout the initial presentation. Just go ahead and use the raise hand function that's in Zoom, and Professor Zenn will call on you, or you can send your questions through the chat. This session finally is being recorded, so keep that in mind. Anything you say will be recorded as well, as will your video if you choose to turn it on while you are speaking. If you'd prefer that your voice not be recorded, you can just put your question in the chat. All right, with all of that said, I am happy to introduce Jacob Zenn. He's the editor of the Jamestown Foundation's Terrorism Monitor publication and the author of the book Unmasking Boko Haram, Exploring Global Jihad in Nigeria. He has written for a number of academic journals and has drafted several reports and monographs on Boko Haram, including editing a multi-authored report for the West Point Combating Terrorism Center in 2018 called Boko Haram Beyond the Headlines. He graduated as a global law scholar from Georgetown Law and from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, although we will not hold that last point against him. And he has studied Uyghur, Persian, and Arabic at various institutions. He is also, importantly, an adjunct assistant professor here at SSP. And if you are a Georgetown student hoping to find another summer course to take, he will be teaching the African Armed Movements course this summer, and there is still some space in that class. So with all of that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and turn it over to Professor Zenn.
Well, thank you very much, Jordan, for that introduction, and for you and SSP inviting me to speak today. It's really a privilege. I'm very happy to share this research with the community and to engage in this exchange, not only today for this presentation, but even moving forward. My email will be on the last slide for any students or colleagues who are interested in maintaining contact. And I am also available on Twitter for a direct message if you wish. And my handle is @BokoWatch. But let's start with the presentation in this Security Around the World series on Boko Haram. And the next slide that we're going to start with, beyond the title, discusses, just shows you where ISIS and Al-Qaeda are active in Africa. And this comes from a report that I wrote for an organization called the New Lines Institute, which was formerly called Center for Global Policy. And although you may hear about ISIS in Africa or jihadist expansion in Africa, from this map, you can see that their activities are quite concentrated. In terms of sub-Saharan Africa, the key domains are the Sahel, where you have JNIM, which is the Al-Qaeda sub-affiliate. It's Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam al-Muslimin, and it exists right alongside the ISIS province, as they call it, Islamic State in Greater Sahara. And they compete and fight with each other in the Sahel. And they have expanded from Mali into Burkina Faso and Niger in recent years, and all the way towards the borders of Ghana, Benin, and Cote d'Ivoire, and even towards Senegal recently. So that's one major cluster. The other major cluster is northeastern Nigeria, and that will be the focus of our talk today. That's what you can see in purple, and that's where the Islamic State province is ISWAP, or Islamic State in West Africa province. And technically in ISIS's organizational structure, ISGS in the Sahel and ISWAP are actually both ISWAP. They're united for ISIS organization, although practically speaking, they don't have that much operational connection. Now, when we talk about Boko Haram, and I'll get into this a little bit more, there's three main factions. ISWAP is the largest faction. Then there's another faction known as the Shekau faction because its leader is Abu Bakr Shekau. And that faction's real name is Jamatu Akhlasuna li Dawati wal Jihad. So it's a very long name. And that's actually part of the reason why the name Boko Haram emerged in the first place, even though no group ever called themselves Boko Haram. It was because the group's original name, Jamatu Akhlasuna li Dawati wal Jihad, was so long that even the media couldn't explain it. And so we have the ISWAP, we have the Shekau faction, and both of those operate in northeastern Nigeria, where you see purple. And then there's another group, and that's called Ansaru, or Ansar al-Muslimin fi Bilad Sudan. That's the Al-Qaeda sub-affiliate in Nigeria, and that's in northwestern Nigeria. So moving onwards towards East Africa, you have Al-Shabaab in green. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that group. It's existed perhaps longer than any of these other groups that I've mentioned. And there is a small ISIS province in Somalia, but it is not able to really withstand Al-Shabaab nor the US and other counterterrorism pressure against it. The final group I'll mention in terms of sub-Saharan Africa is called Islamic State in Central Africa Province, or Icecap, ISCAP. And just in the same way that ISIS put ISGS and ISWAP together in one province per their nomenclature, the Congo and the Mozambique ISIS loyal groups are both merged together under Icecap, even though practically speaking, they don't interact too much. And both of them are actually quite aggressive and increasing their capabilities. So that lets you know the overall parameters. Most likely, ISWAP is by far and away the strongest ISIS province in sub-Saharan Africa. And right now is a very crucial time to be discussing ISWAP because I've been studying the group for a decade or even more now. And right now, ISWAP, that faction of what we call Boko Haram, is as strong militarily as it has ever been. And that shouldn't be surprising because it's been fighting for 10 or so years. So every year it should gain new fighting skill. And beyond that, it does have the possibility to speak with ISIS about its own insurgent tactics and to engage in that type of organizational learning. And in the past 24 hours, ISWAP has captured a Nigerian military base in a place called Dikwa in Borno in the northeastern Nigeria. And only a few weeks ago, they attacked another military base. And all of this is somewhat startling in Nigeria because a year and a half ago, when ISWAP began overrunning military bases or military outposts, Nigeria moved into what they called super camps, which are very large, supposedly impenetrable fortresses, basically. Now, typically in insurgent warfare, this is not a very good sign for the government, because when you start bunkering down in what are called super camps, it means you are no longer readily engaging the population and you've sort of ceded the countryside to the insurgents. And what we've seen happen over the course of the past year and a half is ISWAP has accepted that the military will be based in these super camps, and ISWAP has dominated the roadways and the countryside. They've built up strength, and now a year and a half later, since this super camp strategy was implemented, ISWAP is now targeting the super camps themselves. And I happen to have an article in Politique étrangère, a French publication that's coming out this week, on the stalemate that existed for the last year and a half, because ISWAP couldn't penetrate the super camps for the past year and a half. But this super camp stalemate, I argue, is becoming unsustainable. And incidentally, just now we see ISWAP beginning to penetrate these super camps. The article will actually have an English version and a French version. So I'll be posting the English version on Twitter and to make it available for everybody, or you can email me if you're interested in the English version. So let's move to the next slide now, which discusses some challenges in studying and researching Boko Haram, which may not be all that different from studying other insurgent or jihadi groups, but it's worth mentioning some ways that Boko Haram might be unique. For one, it's very inaccessible. So as you saw on that last map, the group exists in northeastern Nigeria, which during times of peace is accessible by road or even air. However, due to the insurgency for the past 8 years at least, it's been extremely dangerous for anyone to go beyond, say, the capital of Borno State, which is called Maiduguri. To go into the countryside is very dangerous, and nowadays it's exceedingly dangerous. Even in 2012, when I tried to take a roadway in Borno State, that the military didn't let me go. And now it's much worse. So you really can't get there easily to, say, conduct interviews or to just observe. And um, so you have that danger. And then there's COVID, of course, which I meant to say. It's now just difficult to travel to Nigeria. There's visa issues in general, but with COVID, there's extra visa issues. Whatever organization you're with might not let you travel because of COVID and whatnot. So right now, it's a very difficult time to study the group if you want to do field research. Another problematic aspect about studying Boko Haram and jihadi groups and other insurgents generally is it's very hard to come up with answers with absolute certainty. In other words, when we try to say why Boko Haram, and by that I mean all of the factions, because as I mentioned, none is actually called Boko Haram. When I say Boko Haram, I mean ISWAP and Shekau faction, for example. They make tactical shifts. They change their tactics. They change their messaging. But we can't really ask them why they're doing that. We can usually take the evidence that exists and ascertain to the highest level of plausibility why we believe they're doing something. But you never can really get 100 level of certainty. And that's somewhat different than studying, say, markets in Lagos, where you can actually go to the market and do a proper test and experiment about why people sell items at a certain price and why do they lower the price, for example. You can ask people, you can readily observe and come up with clear answers. Or even people who have studied conflict in the middle belt, the center of Nigeria, conflict between, say, Christians or Muslims. That historically has not been such a long-term chronic problem that, after the conflict subsides, you can usually ask people about what happened and come up with a fairly reasonable account with a high level of certainty. With Boko Haram, due to the inaccessibility, you're left often with a lot of questions that you can't always get answered. So you need to rely on what is called, in my view, I think it's important to rely on abductive reasoning, which means providing explanations to the highest level of plausibility. And the way that you test that is by having another person, researcher or scholar, provide their own explanation to explain these phenomena with a higher level of certainty than your own estimation. And I'll give examples of this during this talk when we seek to explain why Boko Haram retreated from urban areas to the countryside in 2013. We can't really know for sure. We can't ask them. But I believe the evidence points to a high level of plausibility of a certain reason that I'll mention later. And again, some sources that you have are interviews, but it's very hard to interview the members. If you do interview members in prison, then it's always risky that the security forces are watching them or that they could be lying to you. If you rely on Boko Haram photos and videos, or even the books that they've written, they obviously have their own biases. Secondary academic literature on Nigeria is abundant, but on Boko Haram is not necessarily abundant because it's a rather new group and it presents something somewhat different than what anyone has seen in Nigerian history, which is why this is now the longest standing insurgency the country has ever faced. And then, of course, there are language and cultural differences. So if you ask, say, a Kanuri-speaking Boko Haram member about radicalization, and it gets translated through Hausa into Kanuri, the meaning of radicalization in another foreign language might not be so easy for someone to understand because it's sort of a term of art that doesn't have a direct translation in other languages. So you can also think about other reasons why studying Boko Haram is difficult as you study that or other groups. So we can now move to the next slide. And I'm going to talk about some new findings on the group, which I've come up with, which you might not have known before, and that might be an added value of this presentation. First, through a various primary source evidence, like memoirs that Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb members have written, I find that the first a jihadist. In other words, the first person to say, we need to wage jihad to overthrow the Nigerian government because it is not a Muslim government. The first person to come into Nigeria to propagate that was a member of the GIA, which is an AQIM predecessor group. And he arrived in 1994 through connections to Nigerian Salafis, and he was expelled from Niger due to Algerian intelligence cooperation with Niger. And then he intermingled with Nigerian Salafis who viewed him as an Afghan jihad veteran, not as some type of evil person. And he began recruiting Nigerians to actually what was the GIA and later became the GSBC and later became AQIM. So this is how I believe the jihadi movement began in Nigeria. And it differed from even what you might call hardcore Salafis, in that there wasn't really an Islamic movement that used jihad to overthrow the Nigerian government. There were movements that wanted to implement Sharia, but none that said we need to wage war in the name of Islam against the Nigerian government. And we can talk more about that in Q&A. Now, another recent finding about the group is the impact of 9/11 and the war on terror. 9/11 was important in a translocal perspective because early on, the Nigerian Salafi community basically sided with bin Laden. And there's tons of audio evidence now to show that. By 2003, they learned about the excesses of Al-Qaeda and pulled back. I argue that was a little bit too late because by that time, the foundation for Boko Haram already began. But more importantly, perhaps, was that Nigeria became involved, and this is not well known yet, but there's some articles coming out about it, that as part of Nigeria signing up to the war on terror, they adopted the sort of intelligence approach to Boko Haram. And the first crackdown on Boko Haram in 2003, when it was just a small group, was part of a war on terror crackdown that followed US policy and Saudi policy. And it was Nigeria's effort to stamp out this budding jihadi movement in sync with what other countries were doing. And as you might know, when you crack down on a group, even if it's infancy, it can come back stronger than before. And that's what happened to the very early Boko Haram. Another key period was the 2009 to 2011 period. By 2009, Boko Haram had revived and had begun preaching in public. And the Nigerian Salafis that had once sympathized with jihadism had totally pulled back from it. And they agreed with the government to now wipe out Boko Haram, which they tried to do. New documentary evidence has shown how Boko Haram was really rattled after 2009, but they did receive some significant support from AQIM to keep them afloat. Then they could reemerge in Nigeria by 2010 and begin the insurgency that has continued to today. So it's very interesting reading the letters that they wrote to AQIM talking about their desperation. Now, maybe they were embellishing to make sure AQIM gave them money and weapons and training. But nonetheless, I think that's a crucial way to explain how a group that was considered defeated in 2009 reemerged in 2010. Now, the period that really leads us to where we're at today is that Boko Haram was an urban problem until 2013. But by 2014, it became a rural insurgency. And that's basically what it has continued to be, conquering rural areas. And I attribute this rapid ability to dominate the countryside to tactics learned from Nigerians who had been with AQIM or its sub-affiliates in Mali in 2013. And as a strategic move, they decided to shift to the countryside in 2013, and which has been a very successful guerrilla tactic for them compared to operating in the urban areas since 2013. But it was also in response to the development of local civilian vigilantes in urban areas in 2013 that Boko Haram decided to remove itself from the city and move to the rural areas where these vigilantes couldn't watch them as easily. And then the ISIS era has begun from 2015, and that's a very complex era, and I'll talk about it a little bit more through the next slide, where I'll give examples of the ways that ISIS has interacted with Boko Haram. So we can now move to the next slide. So this will help you understand the way that ISIS interacts with its provinces. And this is the ISWAP case, but maybe it will be relevant if you study ISIS Khorasan province in Afghanistan or the other ones in Africa. One of the interesting things is that so there was a major split in the group in 2016, but even before that, ISIS announced Abu Bakr Shekau as the leader of ISWAP in March 2015 when Shekau pledged loyalty. So basically, ISIS accepted Shekau as leader, even though he was extremely ruthless. Now, there was some behind the scenes maneuvering by Shekau's enemies within ISWAP. They actually wanted Shekau to pledge loyalty to ISIS so that ISIS would eventually demote him and name someone else as the leader. And therefore, the foot soldiers would follow ISIS and not be loyal to Shekau anymore. So there was a big ulterior motive going on in the initial pledge to ISIS in March 2015, which just shows that there's all this politics going behind. Notwithstanding that they were loyal to Baghdadi, which was a big trend among jihadis in 2015, they still wanted to lure this ruthless leader, Abu Bakr Shekau, into pledging loyalty just to overthrow him. And so they sort of used ISIS for that. And that's why Shekau was actually reluctant to pledge initially. And then finally in August 2016, ISIS announced that Shekau was demoted. A new leader, Abu Musab al-Barnawi, who was the son of the original leader from 2004 to 2009, was the new leader. And that actually helped moderate ISWAP initially, because Shekau, who was responsible for the Chibok kidnapping, was now removed. So you can see ISIS has been sort of used in a way by some of the moderates, but they themselves got overthrown in 2018, which is the Dapchi case. So you had a kidnapping like the Chibok kidnapping of 100 or so schoolgirls from Dapchi, Yobe State in early 2018. ISWAP took them, they spoke with ISIS. ISIS told them to give them back. These are just students, they're not actively fighting you. Tell them not to get Western education, but don't enslave them. We don't want you to be like Shekau, because Shekau enslaved Muslim women from Chibok and elsewhere. They said these were Muslim girls from the school, bring them back. The one Christian girl was kept as a slave by ISWAP, and she remains an ISWAP quote unquote slave today. So that was another ISIS interaction. But you see that there was actually some members of ISWAP that were sort of like Shekau, even though they had overthrown him, and they did the Dapchi kidnapping. By late 2018, there was another case where ISWAP raided a military facility that had humanitarian workers, including 2 young female aid workers, Saifura Korsa and Hawa Liman. And now ISWAP killed them because on ISIS's recommendation, because, and this is done through some communications and sources that we can discuss, and this showed a harder line ISWAP, and they justified killing these 2 Muslim girls because they were actually serving the government, unlike the Dapchi girls. And they took one other Christian lady into slavery from there, and she, like Leah Sharabu, who was from Dapchi, became a slave. The 2 other young female workers were executed in an ISIS-style video. Now, I'm sort of giving some trend lines that ISWAP was becoming more like Shekau, who they originally had overthrown. And what happened was the moderates who overthrew Shekau in August 2016 were overthrown again in March 2019 for more hardline leaders. And so ISWAP today is not quite as ruthless as Shekau, but is basically very ruthless today. And that's because the moderates were executed and purged in March 2019, including those who had spoken with the Nigerian government about releasing the Dapchi girls and considering some type of ceasefire. So that was a big shift. And I also think ISIS welcomed the shift in March 2019 and actually supported it because ISIS was losing its territories in Iraq and Syria, and it needed very hardline ISIS-committed leaders of ISWAP. And that's why the moderates who had been formally accepting of al-Qaeda needed to get killed or removed. And so ISIS welcomed the hardliners taking over ISWAP in March 2019, and they've remained firmly committed to ISIS, notwithstanding ISIS's territorial losses and the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Another example of ISIS intervention into ISWAP in terms of understanding these dynamics was the Christmas Day Chibok Christian executions. This was people from Chibok, not the girls, but from that same area. And that's actually seen in one of these images where you see them lined up with Guantanamo attire. Just so you know, there's no graphic images in this video, but there are images of these groups. And ISWAP was initially going to try to ransom these Christians from Chibok, but on Christmas Day and after al-Baghdadi's death, ISIS wanted them to be featured in a new propaganda campaign for ISIS. So I believe that rather than ISWAP gaining some money for releasing them, the priority of being featured in ISIS propaganda was sort of became the priority, and they actually executed them rather than getting money. So that was an example of ISIS saying, no, don't do it your way. We need you to do something really good propaganda for us on Christmas and to avenge al-Baghdadi's death. And that actually fits with a broader trend that we've seen. ISWAP adopts ISIS media, the same camera angles, the same music, the same imagery like Guantanamo outfits for their victims and so forth. Also, since March 2019, we've seen ISWAP killing aid workers. This did not happen before March 2019. So this was some type of tactical change, which coincided with the new hardline leaders coming into power in ISWAP. So there's been many aid workers abducted since then, and even there's reports of 7 abducted just yesterday from the military base that I said was captured. And this makes humanitarian efforts much more dangerous and much more complicated. Also, only since March 2019 have Christians been specifically targeted in terms of burning down their churches. This existed in 2012 under Shekau, but it's revived since March 2019. And they've used ISIS rhetoric like demanding tax from the Christians, or else they will kill them. Now, it's important to mention there are 2 other factions, Ansaru, which is the Al-Qaeda loyal group that operates in northwestern Nigeria. It's mostly involved with these banditry networks, which is a very important issue, but they were killed by Shekau for revolting from him in 2012, and they actually had to leave northeastern Nigeria, and that's partly why they're in the northwest. And then you have Shekau's faction, as I mentioned, Jama'atu Ahl Sunni Dawati wal Jihad. He also exists in Borno, near to ISWAP, but they sort of separated their territories. Shekau is quite ruthless, and he's just not as powerful as ISWAP. So it's probably more important to talk about ISWAP for this presentation. But Shekau is the best known Nigerian Boko Haram member because of his maniacal videos and extreme ruthlessness. And if you're familiar with the group, you've probably heard of him. His group is still a major threat still. It's just not as much as ISWAP, and he still mocks or mimics ISIS videos and ISIS rhetoric, even though he's no longer part of ISIS. So now we can move to the next slide. And that is the final slide. And so solutions are very difficult to fathom right now. Neither ISWAP nor Shekau's faction are really willing to talk peace. They are sometimes willing to exchange hostages. In ISWAP's case, if ISIS doesn't get involved, like it did in that Christmas 2019 case. And even if they make these tactical exchanges for hostages, they often get money and their own prisoners back. So it proves to be quite a bit of a benefit for them. And given ISWAP's military successes recently, we don't really see any possibility of peace talks. In contrast, in Mali, you see some semblance of possibility for peace talks between the Al-Qaeda group, JNIM, and Mali's government or Islamic clerics. And JNIM might be following the Taliban example. So there is some sort of hope for a non-military end of the conflict, but in Nigeria, we don't see that. Another issue is northwestern Nigeria. You might have heard that 300 or so schoolgirls were kidnapped a week ago and released today, but there were also about 400 boys that were kidnapped a few weeks before that, and Shekau actually claimed it because he had a liaison to those bandits. They were also released. Again, the bandits get money for this, so it just makes them more empowered. And there's been a lot of other kidnappings in northwestern Nigeria. So there's a major security issue there as well. And a final issue to mention is the new US administration. I'm not aware of any major change in the US outlook toward Africa. I don't think the new administration has really had time to really focus on Africa yet or Boko Haram. The concentration has mostly been on geopolitics with Russia and China and the main ISIS core insurgency in Syria and Iraq. So I don't see any major US policy changes from the first months of the new administration. But now we have more time to go into Q&A and engage in deeper discussion for the next 30 or so minutes. So please feel free to ask a question if you wish. And I'll call on somebody if I see their hand up, or if I miss somebody's hand up, then Jordan can, of course, help me locate a hand. So I see two participants with hands raised, and those would be, I think, Radhika and Justin. So Radhika, please unmute yourself and then ask your question. And then Justin, please unmute yourself and ask the question. And we'll do two at once.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. I learned a lot. So I just have a question on Icecap in the DRC. So I remember about 2 years ago is when I started seeing articles about how they were gaining a foothold. When did that truly happen? And do you think that they're there to stay?
Great question. And Justin?
Yeah, kind of on the topic you were just talking about in terms of U.S. policy towards Nigeria. I noticed General Townsend, the head of AFRICOM, was in Nigeria a couple days ago. So I'm wondering if maybe unrelated to that meeting, but whether there's a possibility of more U.S. military intervention or U.S. involvement in Nigeria. I know you said that it's currently unclear, but just in terms of like looking at possible futures.
Sure. So the Icecap case, so returning to Radhika's question and then Justin's, the Icecap case is very interesting because ISIS announced Icecap's formation in April 2019, merging Mozambican insurgents and Congolese insurgents. The Congolese insurgents were mostly part of a group called the ADF, which I'm sure you are studying. And the Mozambique insurgents were part of a group that generally called themselves Al-Shabaab, not related to the Somali group. So they were sort of separate groups, and like in the Congolese case, a fairly long-standing insurgency. But at least some factions within the ADF had established a communication line with ISIS. And at least those factions pledged loyalty to ISIS, and ISIS accepted and then made them Icecap. So sometimes you might have some attacks happening in Congo, near to the Uganda or Rwanda borders even, that are carried out by the ADF, and it might be a faction that's not sort of connected to ISIS, and maybe it won't be claimed by ISIS. But sometimes you'll have the factions that are connected to ISIS carry out an attack, and then ISIS will claim it. Like there was a major prison break a few weeks ago in Congo, and that was almost certainly done by one of the factions in contact with ISIS, based on the speed at which ISIS claimed it and the detail that ISIS provided. So do you call the entire ADF Icecap, or just the factions loyal to ISIS Icecap? These are also questions that, say, the United Nations are trying to answer now. But certainly that insurgency has sort of deeper history, and it's more recently that they've become connected to ISIS and adopted certainly ISIS media styles and perhaps some ISIS tactics. So how do you sort of label that insurgency now? It remains a question open to analysts. And in terms of the US and Nigeria, as you mentioned, the general was just there. And I just think it's early on right now to conjecture on what the change in the US position might be. Things are certainly developing. And as they do develop, it would be the type of article that would be worth writing for someone who's following this and publishing with some web publication like African Arguments or another one, or maybe a Georgetown publication to shed light, to enlighten people on what the US policy toward Nigeria might be. My guess is that the US is probably going to be a little bit more focused on the Sahel than Nigeria. One, because I think France is prioritizing the Sahel, and you also have ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Sahel. Nigeria is still fairly guarded about its sovereignty in Borno, so there's not really a chance for US troops to be involved in Nigeria right now, whereas US troops are involved in places like Niger, and they are involved in spy missions throughout Mali. So I think there's more opportunity for the US to become involved militarily in Mali, and that's part of the reason why the US is sort of taking advantage of that opportunity to become more involved in the Sahel. And also France has its hands full, and it really needs the support of the US there. So I think that's another reason why the US will focus on the Sahel more than Nigeria. And the US might also think that Boko Haram, ISWAP, is sort of contained to the Northeast. And so they are sort of letting Nigeria and hopefully its neighbors like Chad and Cameroon deal with that. But I think that's why northwestern Nigeria is important, because that area of operation is directly linked to the Sahel. And so if the US is going to be involved in the Sahel, they won't be able to avoid looking at northwestern Nigerian trend lines. And that involves banditry, smugglers, and jihadists that are in one way or another connected to trans-Sahelian networks. So now we can move to the question from Tara. And so please unmute your phone and ask the question.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for giving this talk today. So I was wondering what your assessment is of the idea that perhaps ISGS and ISWAP may at some point be collaborating, and whether, I know some people have posited that perhaps they will start to merge as ISGS moves south through Niger and ISWAP moves west. But I think from my understanding, the prevailing idea is that currently most of the activity in northwestern Nigeria is more banditry and criminal activity. So what is your assessment of that situation?
Yes, so ISWAP and ISGS, Islamic State in Greater Sahara, are technically, the same group, although practically they're not. Notably, ISIS announced that ISGS was part of ISWAP in April 2019. And that was also 1 month after the ISWAP leadership change. And at that time, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and ISIS publications had been promoting the ISGS leader, Abu Adnan Abu Walid al-Sahrawi. And so there was a lot of communications and organizational changings occurring with the center at that time. But although ISGS had a relationship to the center and ISWAP had its own relationship to the center, I don't necessarily think that ISGS and ISWAP were communicating with each other. They both had the contact to ISIS. Now, there were expectations that they would practically link together in April 2019. And that was partly because ISGS was ascendant. At that time, it was stronger than JNIM, which is its Al-Qaeda rival. And by the end of 2019, ISGS was taking down military barracks in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And ISWAP was also becoming ascendant. However, I think one of the reasons why they haven't converged as much as some might have expected is that at the end of the day, JNIM is winning the battle with ISGS. These two groups are fighting and killing each other, just as Al-Qaeda and ISIS have elsewhere. And not only JNIM, but also French, US, and Malian and neighboring army military pressure has sort of contained ISGS, and it's not really able to expand. It was able to conduct an attack near the capital of Niger some months back, killing aid workers. And that's about as far as it's gotten toward Nigeria. It also has operated a little bit in Benin, but that's again as the extent of its operations. So the idea of ISGS moving down into northwestern Nigeria operationally has sort of not occurred. And nonetheless, the fact that you do have some Ansuru presence in northwestern Nigeria, Shekau has established his own sub-affiliates in northwestern Nigeria, although they're sort of like bandits with a liaison to him. And the fact that ISWAP has attempted to set up in northwestern Nigeria does raise the 5-year time horizon about the northwestern Nigerian front and ISGS or JNIM pushing down into Niger and then having them meet up. But so far, fortunately, the security around Niamey, Niger is still more or less strong enough that these two areas of operation are separate. But it's definitely something that you need to keep watching out for. And so I think for the time being, you won't be seeing as much ISWAP, ISGS coordination as had been anticipated initially. So I'm not sure if anyone else has a question, but feel free to raise your hand if so.
Looks like we have a few in the chat as well.
Sure. The question's in the chat. So Matthew asks, what are your thoughts on engaging non-state actors like warlords or other local actors to combat ISIS cells in Africa as a CT strategy? Well, that's a very complicated question. And perhaps you can learn lessons from other experiences that the US has had, like Afghanistan, where they sided with warlords to combat the Taliban with at least mixed results. I would definitely agree with aligning with local actors to combat ISIS cells. But when you deal with warlords, then you're also empowering other non-state actors and other non-state power centers. So you might be choosing one devil over another, but it doesn't do much towards enhancing the power of the state to deal with its own security. So I'd at least be quite cautious about that. Now, when you talk about other local actors, in the case of Nigeria, for example, you have had a strong local actor known as the civilian vigilantes that have combated Boko Haram. And although they've fought with great vigor, unfortunately, it has not been successful in the long run. One reason is that initially they were armed, but not with very sophisticated equipment. And so ISWAP or Shekau was able to massacre these local vigilantes. Then the problem is when you do arm these vigilantes, they're not necessarily under the military rubric, and they were quite susceptible to carrying out their own forms of robbery and stealing and theft and their own human rights violations. So that was another problem. And then as Nigeria tried to formalize them even more, then they sort of just became like an appendage of the military. And although they might be a force enhancer to the military, they weren't this sort of like local spontaneous movement providing intelligence from the ground anymore. They were sort of an appendage of the military. So it's actually been quite mixed in the results. And you can actually read a little bit more about what's called the civilian JTF to learn about that. But I think those opportunities need to be explored, but they need to be understood with the backdrop of how that has worked and not worked elsewhere. So there's another question from Radhika, which is wondering what exactly the financing looks like for ISWAP. Is it mainly from the kidnapping and banditry that you mentioned? What aspects of its financing are unique to ISWAP versus ISIS core? So I think ISIS core financing was somewhat unique in that they did establish their state to a higher degree of formality than you've seen with territories that ISWAP controls. There has not been that much documentary evidence from ISWAP of its taxation systems, although you've seen them give receipts to cattle herders who have paid their tax in cattle to ISWAP, which is a form of money. But ISIS in Syria had a whole litany of documents to, like a real government would. So ISWAP has not done that level of formal taxation. But given the area where it operates, ISWAP does what makes sense, which is tax cattle. And that's a big money maker. It taxes the fish trade locally, which is a big money maker. It's actually a huge money maker. A pepper trade and other trades around Lake Chad. That's why ISWAP is very determined to hold on to its areas around Lake Chad. And then ISWAP and Boko Haram, Shekau faction especially, steal cattle when their enemies have it or people who don't comply with them. And that's actually very valuable. And then you also can't underestimate the theft or pillaging. When they take over a city, they also go into shops and take things like gold. And that's actually quite important. And some United Nations Financial Action Task Force interviews of ISWAP and Boko Haram members, I think, are some of the best in terms of getting anecdotes from the members about the little thing, the seemingly little things they steal here and there, but that make up quite a sizable income for the individual members of the group, in addition to the more institutional ways that the group raises money, like through taxing cattle or fish. And then the idea of ISIS sending money to ISWAP, it's very hard to know about that, but there have been some credible former members who still have interactions with the group, who have been interviewed and written reports about how ISIS provided money, which does make sense that that would have occurred in around the 2015 period when ISIS was still strong, probably much less now. And also keep in mind that Libya used to be ISIS's entrepot into sub-Saharan Africa. Libya was like an ISIS colony to the extent that ISIS actually was sending members from Syria to Libya. And it was sort of, in a way, directly ruled from Syria. And then Libya was sort of going to rule or govern or administer the ISIS provinces in sub-Saharan Africa. But since ISIS has basically been kicked out of Libya as a result of US airstrikes and all of the other Turkish and Russian proxies, ISIS sort of lost that foothold in Africa. and therefore its sort of relationship with the various provinces is removed to a greater degree than it was in 2015, and that probably affects financing too. So there's another question from William about what are your policy recommendations for the current US administration? Is there a solution to provide? That's not an easy question, but I would say that if you're looking at Nigeria, you have the case of Boko Haram and ISWAP in northeastern Nigeria. And this is, anyone would agree, it's basically a disaster throughout much of northeastern Nigeria, particularly Borno. It's not a lost cause. But in contrast, northwestern Nigeria is sort of on the precipice of really falling into a spiral of insecurity and instability, which would affect Nigeria as a whole, which is a very important strategic partner of the US, and affect the Sahel, which, as I mentioned, the US is involved with. So I would recommend that they pay a lot of attention to northwestern Nigeria, even though it does not appear to be as severe as a problem as northeast Nigeria, because you don't want to wait till something spirals out of control before you address it. If you use the terminology of CVE versus PVE, counter-violent extremism versus preventing violent extremism, northwestern Nigeria is still a PVE phase, so there's still a chance to prevent. There's still a chance to work through local communities. There are Islamic clerics talking to the bandits. There's still a chance to get out of the abyss through local interventions, through negotiations, to prevent northwestern Nigeria from becoming like what northeastern Nigeria has become. And the fact that you've had these multi-hundred school children banditry kidnappings in the past months is just indicative of how severe the problem is already, and they don't want it to become worse. So I'd say, one, emphasize northwestern Nigeria. In terms of northeastern Nigeria, I would say that although the US will not have boots on the ground, to the extent that Nigeria will cooperate, if we can do some type of surveillance and provide other types of intelligence and reconnaissance assets that Nigeria doesn't have, that would still be useful. We can, of course, engage in some special operations training. There are concerns about human rights aspects to that, but I would say continue that to the best of our capability. And to the extent that the US has NGO interventions in northeastern Nigeria, it's very hard to do now, but I have tended to find that they're based in Abuja, the capital, and Maiduguri in Borno State, the capital of Borno, is still secure enough that NGOs can be based there. And I think it's actually very useful for civilians who are working on humanitarian efforts to actually be based somewhat near the conflict, but still with enough security it helps them address the conflict better than when you're in Abuja and it feels like a million miles away. So that's sort of my 2 cents on that question. So I'll check if there's any other hands or chat questions, but feel free to pose any ideas or suggestions or disagreements or questions if you'd like in our remaining time. Okay, Jordan, do you have a suggestion on the next step?
If this is it for questions, then I think we can go ahead and wrap up. Give folks about 3 more seconds to pop their hands up if you have any final questions for Professor Zenn. This will be recorded as well, and so you can pull the email address from that final slide if you like. And you, of course, if you're a Georgetown student, can also reach out to Professor Zenn. His email is in the Georgetown system. Looks like we have one more quick question that just popped in, Deanna.
Sure. So the final question, perhaps, but there's still time if one more question wants to come in, is not ISWAP, but do you foresee the level of violence in Burkina Faso becoming better controlled within the next year or so? And this is from Liana. That's a tough question. I think it might be better actually in the last several weeks compared to last year. And that's only because last year you saw some major massacres including on gold mine workers, including on churches, including on security forces, including on villagers. And I think it might improve somewhat because ISGS was more ruthless than JNIM. ISGS was taking cues from ISIS itself. And a lot of the civilian massacres that were happening in Burkina, I would say were attributed to ISGS. And the fact that not only JNIM, but these other foreign and national military actors are clamping down on ISGS should lead to a slight pacification in Burkina. But of course, JNIM still has a decent presence in Burkina. And I think, however, JNIM has some incentive to avoid the level of ruthlessness of ISGS, because JNIM, I think at the end of the day, wants Mali and France to come to the negotiation table and to agree that France will leave West Africa or the Sahel, and the US will leave, and the UN will basically leave, and that they'll come up with some hypothetical deal where JNIM will control some parts of Mali, and maybe the Malian government will control other parts, and it will be sort of like the Taliban, what it wants. And the Taliban wants to control all of Afghanistan, and I think JNIM wants to control all of Mali. So it would be somewhat duplicitous. But either way, because JNIM envisions a seat at the negotiation table, I think it has an incentive not to escalate the level of violence in Burkina, and that might help assuage things for at least the short-term future. Another question came in from Nathan, and this is, due to the Nigerian government's handling of Boko Haram in the context of religious grievances, Christian South, Muslim North, do you think there is a realistic diplomatic nonviolent solution here? Getting more government resources and development projects to Northeastern periphery, more Muslim representation in government. Okay, so I'm quite pessimistic about a nonviolent solution because of the fact that ISWAP and Boko Haram are on the ascendance militarily, and they really have no incentive to negotiate. And I do think you could negotiate with them even now, but you would have to meet their demands because they have the upper hand now. And it would basically mean removing yourself from large tracts of Borno and basically ceding it to ISWAP and Boko Haram in an autonomous Islamic state by their nomenclature. And that would have to be what you need to cede. The only other option, I think, is to do these tactical level negotiations, which is where you get hostages back, but you need to give them money, which has some long-term repercussions. And then I think another opportunity is a type of military campaign like what happened with ISIS in Syria, where they really mitigated ISIS. It's not fully defeated, but its state is gone, for example. I just don't see that type of grand military effort happening, although I think it could potentially lead to the decimation of ISWAP and Shekau faction territories. So I tend to be pessimistic in the short term on that issue. And I think there's a very responsible governor of Borno now, Babagana Zulum. There is development projects going on, and most of the leaders in the Northeast are Muslim, so there is representation. And this governor, Babagana Zulum, is very sincere, the most sincere politician I think that Nigeria has ever had in that region, at least in the past decade or two. And he's making great progress, but mostly only in areas that the government can control. He went to Dikwa just like last week, and he left Dikwa, and that's when Boko Haram ISWAP captured the military base there, just days after he left. And actually, ISWAP consistently attacks cities or towns that he goes to right after he goes to them for development projects. So the problem with development projects is that there's so much insecurity that when you try to initiate them, like Babagana Zulum does, ISWAP destroys that opportunity and kidnaps humanitarian workers because it knows that Nigeria can't have normalcy and that ordinary civilians will lose faith in the government ever achieving normalcy. And hopefully for ISWAP, they will end up joining ISWAP. So that's sort of why I'm pessimistic. There was an anonymous question that came in about, do you think there's political involvement in Boko Haram? Initially, yes, and that was normal. Boko Haram was an above ground dissident group until 2009. And it was natural that from 2009 to 2012, some politicians or wealthy people or even like-minded religious adherents who had contacts with the group maintained those contacts into 2010, 11, and 12. And those types of contacts were perhaps somewhat nefarious, but also an attempt at outreach. Before 2009, there might have actually been actual political adherents. This is a whole nother story, but initially, politicians knew that Boko Haram, even before the insurgency began in 2009, was a potential threat. So they sort of used a carrot and stick, where they gave them some money, gave them some support in order to contain them. They ended up failing to contain them. So that was sort of political machinations before 2009. But my main point is I don't see political involvement to any significant degree since, say, 2013. Boko Haram's really went underground. It's become severely violent, and I don't think any politicians are on that boat. But I can't deny that it doesn't ever happen, because there have been cases in the past few years along the Cameroonian border where there have been Cameroonian politicians that seem to be helping Boko Haram with arms. And so I can't deny that there are some politicians or influential people, or especially business people, involved. But I don't think it's the type of political machinations that had once existed for more reasonable purposes back in the day. So I think that might conclude the discussion. And thank you for these great questions and your attendance. I think Jordan might close it up now.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And thank you, Professor Zenn, for your presentation and for the really engaging discussion following. With that, I will wrap things up and close it out. Thank you all for joining us. And a quick reminder, Professor Zenn's class is African Armed Movements in the summer. If you are a student who is looking for another class to take over the summer, get ahead on your degree requirements. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.